All right, good morning. I'm Ashley Summers, and I'd like to introduce our next presenter. Ronnie Floman is the VP of Marketing at Nexar, a crowdsourced vision company. Nexar is today's sponsor, so many thanks to them for their contributions to the conference. Please note that following this 1-hour presentation, there will be an exhibit hall starting at 11:15, where you can learn more about what Nexar has to offer. So right now, I'll hand it over to you, Ronnie.
Thank you, Ashley. It's a pleasure to be here. As a sponsor, I always have the onus of being especially interesting because people probably want to hear less from sponsors, so I'll try to do my best to really say something that's valuable to all you ITS professionals. As Ashley said, I'm the VP Marketing at Nexar, and I'll be talking about what we do, but mainly what I'd like you to have as the main takeaway from the presentation is that vision data is coming to ITS because car cameras are coming to the world. There are going to be a lot of very interesting applications. Some of them sound futuristic, some of them are news today. And what I wanted this presentation to be is to be a sort of catalog of what you can do when you can see the world at scale with vision data, how it's actually collected, what is crowdsourced vision data, and what does AI have to do with it. Feel free to ask me questions through, I don't know if there's a Q&A. I see there's a chat bar. Feel free to ask me questions and I'll try to answer them as we go along. So just one slide about Nexar, and then I'll start to talk about collecting vision at scale in different use cases. The vision of the company was to make the world collision-free, very idealistic vision of if all cars can see what all other cars can see, can you reduce accidents and save lives? So from this idealistic vision of maybe 5 cars ahead of me will tell me that there's a collision, maybe I'll drive better. And you guys probably know that very well from the discussion of V2V and V2X and V2I. Nexar was begotten. And one of the first thoughts was that even if cars have cameras, or maybe 7 years ago, people were thinking about people filming the road through their phones as they're driving, you need to make vision collection scalable and economical. Vision data weighs a lot in terms of bandwidth, and it's going to be super expensive to actually process. And that's why we started a marketing dash cams with a pretty smart vision collection and aggregation mechanism behind them. And today we're looking mostly at how the world is changing. I'll show you some examples. We just announced change detection for road signs. Today, Nexar is the #1 brand in the US in terms of sales, and Nexar dashcams see about 130 million miles a month. I'll show you what this translates to. And it works in all kinds of applications. Of course, today I'll speak mostly about cities, a little about autonomous vehicles, and I'll touch upon insurance mapping and automotive applications. So let's think first, and this is, I'm done with the Nexar plug. I just want to do some education really on the role of vision. There are 2 ways to think about vision data collection. If you look at what people are doing today in the Robo Taxi world, so all those companies that are looking to launch Robo Taxis that are autonomously driven, they put quite a lot of hardware on those cars. They're rumored to cost about $250,000 each, and they also have a human driver inside just in case. And they're driving around and trying to really train, in terms of machine learning, AI, the car to drive itself. As a way of collecting information about the world, creating a high definition map with very high resolution so the car drives where it should, it's a very expensive mode of seeing the world. And therefore, if we look at coverage, at freshness of data today, it's limited in what it does. Another approach taken by companies like Nexar, but also if you look at companies working on on ADAS, and other systems, companies such as Mobileye or even Tesla, ourselves, we use cameras today to provide real value to drivers. In our case, dash cams, but you can see other ideas, namely ADAS, really. And the idea is, let's see what we can collect today with vision data, and let's see what value we can bring the world today. And not wait for this brave new Robo Taxi world I was just showing, but do all of this with a $50 camera in terms of the cost of the camera, or even less, and see how well we can do with that. And the answer is quite a lot. And in any case, if you think about it, crowdsourced vision is going to be here in many ways or forms. Most new cars have cameras. The data stays in the camera today, in the car today. So you see the car retaining the data just like an ordinary dash cam would, but it's pretty obvious that at some point this data will come out of the car and inform all kinds of applications. For instance, this morning I heard someone discuss taking some vision data about speed signs in Europe, and then conveying that back to the car and saying, hey driver, you cannot exceed the speed limit outside this city because this is a speed limit. And then knowing when the car has traversed the city line and that the speed has changed. So there are going to be a lot of cameras. Industry pundits say about 2024, 2025, most cars will have cameras. They'll have applications like ADAS, like dash cam, like driver monitoring to prevent drowsiness. And once the vision data comes out of the car, which is not very simple because of bandwidth issues, then new applications come to life. So what if you could see what's going on in real time? And you can in many places, like in New York, you could monitor the city and do a lot of ITS applications without installing physical cameras, or some physical cameras can complement vision in certain intersections. You'll be seeing everything, so broad coverage. You'll be able to see things. So you're not going to look at telemetry data and say, oh, I see a lot of hard brakes here. What's going on here? Is there a new stop sign? You can't just use vision data, and I'll talk about it later, because that means that people will need to review thousands and millions of images. So you have AI understanding the image. In this case, understanding the street light, understanding these signs. And you'll need to do it in a way that does not trigger privacy issues, so people don't feel that they're followed. And that is what crowdsourced vision is, really. So there are car cameras that collect images. Images are anonymized. So we will not show faces or license plates in order to make people feel that they're protected. We won't show anything that shows what's going on inside the car. The dash cam, the dashboard, if something is reflecting on the dashboard, just like taking shots, from the car outside. Images are pretty fresh. Places like New York, the image I just showed before, we see most of New York every several minutes, but even in other places like Las Vegas, we see quite a lot, fairly often. And the images and the AI detections on them, so saying this is a road sign, this is a work zone, are localized and put in the right place, so you can easily find them, navigate them, and act upon them. Usually these applications, such as Nexar, this is from something called Nexar Streets, showing a Google Street View versus our view. This is of Chicago. It's not open yet, but we will open it soon, and it will be free. In this case, it's as easy as using Street View, but obviously most people export the data somehow to Esri or other systems. Nexar's drivers today cover 90% of the roads. A lot of unique monthly miles coverage, miles driven, etc. I'll just run over this. And this is the street level anonymization. You can see we blur the license plates and faces. And we also mask the dashboard. So there's a dashboard here. but we use AI to mask it. So if you put in people put their licenses here, et cetera, you can't read it off the dash cam. So what is crowdsourced vision in terms of what the contents are? First of all, there's imagery. So these raw images I was speaking about. So for instance, I could try to capture a lot of raw images from a certain intersection I'm trying to track, or a work zone to understand what's going on. We call that virtual cam. What it does though, because there's no real camera there, it's just using a lot of images from cars that pass there. But it's fairly informative, can show you things in different types of weather and time of day, but it requires a human eye. And then the interesting parts are when you start to do AI detections. In this case, this is a map of street sign detections. And I'd love to hear from you guys if there are other things you'd like detected. We keep having these discussions internally, lane marking quality, pavement quality, too many people at a bus stop, whatever. And after you do the detection, you can also run change detection, which I'll talk about a little later. So seeing the initial state and then marking as it's changed. Both of these require the computer to spy with its AI eye, because it's just not feasible for people to run through these. There are too many images to go through. But once you input AI detections into your workflow, you could save a lot of work, because you'd actually know what is different. For instance, if you have thousands of road signs, you'll be able to know which ones have changed and why. Or if you've implemented something looking at road sign deterioration, you could do that through change detection, et cetera. Because the detections can also look at attributes. So let's look at imagery for a minute. Oops. So imagery I just spoke about. Actually, this one, the wrong image here, good image of probably the snow. The wrong image here is detections. This is actually detection of a work zone, which we have in here. Detections is what I just spoke about. Here, they're elements of work zones. Work zones are actually very tricky to detect. They're made out of several elements. You need to make sense of them, and you need to understand the impact on the lane. You can also detect hotspots where people are braking, road signs. We're looking into detecting anything from foliage to any sort of road furniture. The tricky thing is, and I'll talk about that later, is there's a time factor as well. So you could tell me I want a detector for a tree that has fallen on the road, but if it had fallen on the road and was removed an hour later, probably I won't be able to detect it well, but I would be able to do a daily work zone detector in many areas in the US. So it really, really depends. Road signs, maybe you need to run the detections less often. This is just that we ran some checks on OSM data, and we had these cool detections of temporary signs. They're not real signs. I just love this. I always like showing this, when the sign is in the wrong place. First case in point of detections is road sign change. We just launched this with Las Vegas, with the Regional Transportation Commission of Southern Nevada. And I believe JP will be speaking to you guys as well. So for instance, this is a road in the Las Vegas Valley with sign. And this is, so what the person using CityStream or application would do is he'll get this sign, this indication that something has changed here with this sign. So there's a new 45 speed limit sign. This is the before, and then when you toggle, you can see the after here. This can be very useful, probably to find out missing signs or deteriorating signs. It's a classic example of change detection. The bigger example, of course, is work zones, which we'll talk about later. But theoretically, you could have other forms of change detection. really complementing surveys that you've done, even a very rich metropolitan areas that do a LiDAR scan of all their road inventory and street furniture can then, in between these surveys, use change detection to find out what has changed in the meantime. And that brings me kind of to these really two open questions I just mentioned to myself to be talking to about is, what other changes are worthwhile tracking? Probably the ones that have to do with safety and liability. Maybe changes to either to lanes or to bollards or any other protective equipment. And then LiDAR mapping, again, even when it's done, since LiDAR mapping is more on the what I call the Robo Taxi approach, so very expensive, doesn't happen often, you could complement that with crowdsourced vision in the future. Work zones, another example of change detection. Our work with RTC. RTC is very unique, covers public transit, it's an MPO. There's a lot of planning going on there with some of the work commissioned by the local agencies and some of it overseen by RTC. And that means that there can be a lot of issues with the impact of work zones on congestion. And indeed, there's a lot of complaints in Vegas that they just created this huge piece of congestion. Then people at RTC started asking themselves, how can they manage that? And what can they do? And then they met us. And the original ask for these vision AI detections were, where are the orange cones, which actually are not, cones are not used anymore. They use a different type of barricade. And they wanted to find the orange cones and just see where they are. And then understand what's going on with traffic control, what's going on with safety, and how is that impacting congestion? Because even if the work zones were licensed, maybe having several of them was a problem. Many issues, as I'll show you later, with them blocking bus-only lanes, bus stops, etc. Here are some images. I just took out the fun ones. Outdoor dining in June of last year. They used this to block them. A construction zone that made the bus change lanes. You can see it's identifying the drums, the diamond sign. It's identifying them element by element, grabber cones. Here. And also on the map, it's actually indicating where the work zone is and what the lane impact is. And in this case, construction elements lying around, blocking the parking space. This is a little like the temporary detection I showed you before with the road worker holding the stop sign. Only in this case, this is actually blocking parking space and should not be left around. And this enables whoever controls the system to just pick up the phone and say, hey, move these barricades away in drums. Construction zones are very, very interesting, and I think they're going to get more interest because they're a classical case where when you think about autonomous driving, you're thinking about work zones. If you have a work zone, think about that. You're usually expecting cars to drive on the wrong lane, maybe in the wrong direction, to do some detour on the road. And when you think about AVs and HD maps used for autonomous vehicles, they actually try to map the lane level at a very, very high resolution. So suddenly things are very, somebody's moved the cheese for that autonomous vehicle. And that's why self-driving cars are actually very, very sensitive to traffic cones. There's this great video, I don't know if you've seen it, that went out in May, where somebody was riding in a Waymo and the Waymo just froze at the sight of a traffic cone, which I thought was great, which actually is good. But it means that in the longer run, AVs and cities that enable AVs either need to not to drive around construction zones or actually know where they are so that they won't be either freezing next to this, which does not require freezing, or if this work zone requires you to change lanes, then they'll know what to do. This is a great example that I've seen in the RTC webinar, where you can actually see this car, the work zone requires you to drive the wrong way. And that's like the physical example of why work zones are such an area of interest. Other uses of crowdsourced vision. This is not something we're actually doing. It's something I'm just really curious about and we're looking at. What happens with utility cuts? So let's say you have work zones for utility cuts, and you want to know that things were done well. So just one thing I may have not said, when you look at this world, there's also a question of what the permit was to the people encroaching on the lanes. And one of the things here, some of it is preventing congestion, minimizing impact, but some other things, and you can see that in cities like New York and LA, is to ensure that work zones don't, or they work as planned or work as permitted and work safely. So if you look at this utility cut idea, we've been speaking to the highway officials. They have issues in enforcing the work zone permit conditions. They want to prevent traffic delays. And they're worried about utility cuts that result in funding to fix the utility cuts without the ability to prove that, that something went wrong. And then the idea is, what if you take vision and you actually put it into your workflow? Previously, you know, when I was talking about road sign change, what if you could get an alert about top 10 road sign changes you should care about, and you could review only those instead of surveying everything, and then input them as a work order into some CRM or any other way you're managing your work. With utility cuts, you could perhaps ingest the road construction permits, look at the work zone through Vision AI and verify that it's complying with it, monitor the road construction, and then understand whether post the work there are pavement defects and deterioration over time. So really ingesting the permit, checking the permit within the system, verifying it's been completed, and then looking at the warranty period. Again, it's not something we do now, but it's one of the things you could do with Vision AI. More things you can do with Vision AI. We're working with Blinksy, a company in Utah. They're using our imagery and they're running AI to look at the lane markings. And they're doing the exact same thing. They're using criteria to classify the road markings, the lane markings, and really tell Utah which roads require fixing on lane markings. Again, it is a form of change detection, really. And it can be very valuable. And another example of the things you can do with Vision AI. So again, poring over those images is likely not practical, whilst actually using Vision AI to determine which areas in a map are red and which are green is probably good use of time. Another example, fairly futuristic, but I just love it, so I always use it. We ran a pilot in Milan, and then the question was, can you do something that's very dynamic and that looks at the curb or at free parking availability? One thing I'd like to mention here is crowdsourced vision can really be used by several players. It can be used by autonomous vehicle companies to better understand the road in real time, beyond what the AV is seeing. It can be used by cities or ITS professionals to understand what's going on in the road throughout the day, but it can also be used by drivers. So if I can see parking spots that someone ahead of me is seeing, I could actually have a great parking application, or if I could see people that are double parked, I can maybe drive more safely or collision ahead. This is really touching on what people conceived of V2V, vehicle to vehicle originally, and I'll touch upon that in the end. But in this case, we were doing a pilot with an automotive player in Milan and wanted to see whether if you could run taxi drivers with cameras, how many parking spots you could see. So first of all, you could see quite a lot of free parking spots. About each taxi driver saw, or his car saw, about 30 detections per driving hour. And if you were driving and we had the free parking spot application ready, you could have seen, gotten information about a parking spot near you, which could be relevant to you within about 90 minutes. I think it's pretty obvious to everyone on this webinar that all this crowdsourced information, whichever it is, can be valuable in the navigation sense. So, it's driving and seeing the parking spots, using a neural network, so AI, to figure out that it's a parking spot, and then comparing it to regulation data to make sure it's a legit parking spot and not a driveway. Again, we check the latency and how frequently you can see them. But I think the interesting ITS question is whether you could run one of those. Again, this is futuristic. It's not something that we sell today, to better understand parking behavior. Those stories about cars going around in very congested areas, looking and looking and looking for parking spots. You could maybe better understand delivery windows, use of on-street parking, and perhaps eliminate congestion by better planning of a parking policy. I think this is not what this is doing today, but I think that's another one of those applications of crowdsourced vision networks. Some key considerations before I go on to talking about V2V very shortly, and then we'll open for questions. We asked people on a webinar a while ago, what do they use to visually examine an issue? As you can see, most people do not use something visual that they can actually see from their computer. And when you think about crowdsourced vision, there are a lot of choices that are not intuitive, but that you should probably think about. One is image freshness, right? If there are not a lot of dash cam drivers in the area, your images will not be very fresh. They may be 2 months old, older, or if you're lucky, an hour old. The selector here is just an example, but you really need to think about how old those images should be and how that works within an application. Maybe weekly construction zone is good enough in most of the area, and maybe daily is required in another. There's a cost difference. You need to run the AI models to make that happen. How far do you want to go back and understand images from a week ago, a month ago, or a month ago? How many images do you want to see? Do you want to see a good image of the work zone with everything marked in it, or do you want to run and look at tens of those images to understand more? That requires some human labor, of course. And where do you want to cover crowdsourced vision? It's one of those things where people think about crowdsourced vision. If they buy into it, they say, oh, it's going to be real time. But the answer is no. And you really have to play with this selection and think about your use case and understand what you like to have. Probably, for instance, for the utility cuts example, it doesn't really have to be real time, but it has to look at the utility cut and show how it's behaving over time. But perhaps blocking a bus lane, et cetera, those behave differently. And then what do you want to detect? Another question we asked, how old are the images that you like to see? But again, this really depends on who you are and what the application is. And then just last words on V2X. I'm pretty sure most of you know what V2X is. And as a standard, it hasn't really been widely deployed as expected, and the applications are still in flux in a way. And I think the real game changer here is that V2V was conceived with the idea that it will use telemetry data. So a car will say, I just hard braked around here. And maybe a piece of infrastructure will tell you, a lot of people are waiting here, go somewhere else, or maybe traffic lights will behave differently. But with vision data, the game is actually very, very different. They're car cameras, and suddenly you see things. You're not guessing that a lot of people have been slowing down because perhaps there's a work zone there. You can actually see it. And what happens is that in this future, which isn't that far, with crowdsourced vision coming from many cameras on the road, and once technologies like Nexar's happen with many vision detections on the road, V2X will change. You'll have a shared memory of the road versus me. So me messages is me saying, I just hard braked, and cars around me receiving a message, versus pedestrian ahead, double parking ahead, fallen road sign ahead. Vision is going to change the game because you could use 5G to really create this small local map that would give me a feed into my car. There needs to be a killer app for this. Maybe parking, maybe free parking spot, maybe all kinds of self-driving applications that will require getting real-time mapping information from around the car. It really depends, but surely this will change how V2X will work. And just one last word, we still have openings for a 3-month license for work zone detections. You can check it on our site and see if you're eligible for that. It's part of what we're doing for the infrastructure bill to help agencies and states. And that's about it. Feel free to send me an email. I'll be sending you the slides from this. Hopefully you'll be interested in them. And I'm open for questions. And if not, I'll give you back the time, and we'll be waiting for you in the virtual exhibit hall.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. Any questions from the group?
Oh, I do see something in the chat. Byron is asking whether the applications crowdsourced vision apply to other modes of transit like biking, walking. I think it's very interesting. You could probably, when there's broad coverage, you could probably know quite a lot about biking. Walking, I don't know if people walk around with cameras. I will say that I've seen, for instance, scooter companies, shared electric micromobility, talking about a similar kind of dash cammy approach to I think to prove the safety and the efficacy of those scooters by putting a camera on them and then sharing the data. So you could possibly kind of feed that into whatever cars are seeing. But that's not something we do currently. Wildlife. And then Tesla. Okay, so wildlife, probably we could do a detector for everything. It really is a question of who's asking for it and why. There are these applications for detecting tree canopies that are too high that we've heard of, or tree canopies touching electric poles, which would probably be very, very effective. Wildlife, yes, but with this big caveat of you see wildlife near the road or from the road, just like I'd be driving by and seeing retail locations. But if the wildlife is hiding in the forest, we probably won't see it. Tesla cameras. Currently, no. Tesla also has cameras, of course. I don't know if they send out all the imagery. I didn't get into that technology, but that's actually fairly difficult. But in terms of the approach to collection and access to images, I think there's this divide, as I mentioned initially. The Robo Taxi companies using super expensive cameras like Google Street View cameras and LiDARs to create a very detailed understanding of the road versus using cheaper cameras like Tesla, like us, and proving that you can actually see quite a lot. Do we have any use cases from the Rocky Mountain region to share? No, but I'd love to have them. And if anyone makes use of our free work zone detection license in the previous slide, then I will be able to share them next time when I come. Any other questions? I think not. Anyway, feel free to talk to me. We're in a mode where we're trying to solicit a lot of information for our next products. So if you have any ideas about detectors, thoughts about how this can be integrated with your workflows, crazy free parking spot ideas, write to me and we'll be very happy to interview you or work with you on the free work zone license for 3 months.
Great, thank you so much. We'll go ahead and break now, and we'll come back together at 11:15 for breakout sessions, including the exhibit hall.